Imagine calling your parents for help on a dark country road. They're driving to find you. You're talking, guiding them, staying connected. And then, without warning, you say two words, "Oh shit," and you're gone forever. This is the haunting true story of Brandon Swanson, a 19-year-old who vanished during a phone call that never ended. On May 14, 2008, Brandon Swanson was driving home through rural Minnesota after celebrating the end of his spring semester at college. It was late, the roads were empty, and he was less than an hour from home. But somewhere in the darkness, Brandon's car slid into a ditch. He wasn't hurt, the car was stuck, but he was fine, so he did what anyone would do. He called his parents. What happened next would become one of the most baffling missing persons cases in American history, because Brandon Swanson didn't just disappear, he vanished while his parents were listening. Brandon Swanson was a typical 19-year-old from Marshall, Minnesota. He'd graduated from Marshall High School the year before and was studying wind turbine technology at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, about 30 miles from his hometown. By all accounts, Brandon was responsible, level-headed, and close with his family. On the night of May 13, 2008, Brandon stayed in Canby to celebrate the end of classes with friends. He attended a couple of parties, and while friends said he'd been drinking, no one thought he was intoxicated. Around midnight, Brandon decided to drive home. The route was simple, 30 miles of rural highways he'd driven many times before. But just before 2 a.m., Brandon's parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, received a call. Brandon told them he'd accidentally driven into a ditch and couldn't get the car out. He wasn't injured, but he needed a ride. When his parents asked where he was, Brandon said he thought he was near Lind, a small town about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. He told them he could see lights in the distance and would walk toward them. His parents immediately got in their truck and headed out to find him. What makes this case so unsettling is that Brandon stayed on the phone with his parents the entire time. As Brian Swanson drove toward Lind, he kept his son talking. Brandon described what he was seeing: fields, wire fences, and the sound of running water nearby. His father asked him to flash his car's headlights so they could spot him. Brandon said he was flashing them, but his parents saw nothing. Minutes passed. Then, Brandon said something that made his father's stomach drop. He mentioned hearing water, like a river. Brian knew the area well, and there was no river near Lind. That's when he started to realize something was very wrong. Brian carefully asked Brandon what direction he'd been driving from Canby. Brandon hesitated, uncertainty creeping into his voice. He thought he'd been heading southwest, but the more they talked, the more it became clear Brandon had no idea where he actually was. By this point, they'd been on the phone for nearly 47 minutes. Brandon's frustration was growing. He was cold, walking through dark fields, following distant lights that never seemed to get closer. Then, without warning, Brandon interrupted himself. His voice changed. He said, "Oh shit," and then silence. The line didn't drop. The line stayed connected, but Brandon never spoke again. Brian and Annette frantically called out to Brandon through the phone. They could hear wind, rustling grass, and the sound of water in the distance, but there was no response. After several agonizing minutes, they hung up and tried calling back repeatedly. Nothing. At 6:30 that morning, the Swansons reported Brandon missing to police. At first, officers told them it wasn't unusual for a young man his age to stay out all night. One officer even said Brandon had a right to be missing, but the Swansons knew something terrible had happened. Later that morning, police obtained Brandon's cell phone records. What they discovered was shocking. Brandon hadn't been near Lind at all. His phone had pinged off a tower near Taunton, 25 miles the opposite direction. Searching that area, deputies found Brandon's car in a ditch along a gravel road, doors open, keys missing, but there was no sign of Brandon. Search teams, including bloodhounds, tracked a scent trail from the car across fields to the Yellow Medicine River. The dogs followed the scent to the water's edge, where it seemed to enter the river. But then, strangely, the scent appeared on the other side and continued along the opposite bank before eventually disappearing. Despite extensive searches, covering over 120 square miles over several years, no trace of Brandon Swanson has ever been found. So, what happened to Brandon Swanson? The prevailing theory is that he accidentally fell into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. The river was running high that night, and in complete darkness, Brandon may not have seen how close he was to the water's edge. But Brandon's mother, Annette, doesn't believe that's what happened. She points out that the search dogs tracked his scent across the river and along the far bank. If he'd drowned, would the scent have continued on the other side? Another theory involves foul play. Sheriff Jack Vizecki said he couldn't rule out the possibility that someone else was involved, though there's no evidence to support this. Some have speculated that Brandon may have encountered someone in those dark fields. His final words, "Oh shit," suggest he saw or realized something sudden and alarming. There's also the mystery of how Brandon became so disoriented. How could someone familiar with the area be 25 miles from where they thought they were? Some have suggested he may have been more intoxicated than his friends realized, but his father said Brandon sounded coherent and oriented during their conversation, at least until he admitted he was lost. Out of this tragedy came meaningful change. Brandon's parents, devastated by the initial police response, lobbied the Minnesota state legislature to pass what became known as Brandon's Law. Signed in 2009, the law requires police to begin investigating missing adult cases immediately, rather than waiting. It also mandates that agencies notify each other promptly and clarifies which agency is the lead investigator. 4 other states have since passed similar legislation. For years, the Swansons kept their porch light on every single night, a beacon hoping to guide Brandon home. That light became a symbol of their unwavering hope and a reminder of a son who simply vanished into the darkness. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in recent American history. A young man, connected to his parents by phone, walking through fields on a spring night, suddenly gone without a trace. No body, no answers, just the echo of those final words hanging in the darkness. If you have any information about Brandon Swanson's disappearance, please contact the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And if this case moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so Brandon's story continues to reach people who might have answers. His family deserves closure. Brandon deserves to be found. The last call should never have been the last time they heard his voice.